US President Donald Trump has made good on his threats to tear up the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and reimpose crippling sanctions. The latest measures were announced by US Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who also gave Iranian leaders a blunt warning.
The Iranian regime has a choice. It can either do a 180-degree turn from its outlaw course of action and act like a normal country, or it can see its economy crumble.
The Trump administration has argued that the sanctions will help cut billions of dollars from Iran's war chest, which has been used to fund proxy militias in Syria, Yemen, Lebanon and Iraq. But the US made exceptions for some of Iran's largest oil customers. 8 importers have been granted 180-day waivers that will allow them to gradually reduce their oil imports from Iran. Among them is Turkey, which imports nearly half of its oil needs from the country. The latest sanctions also target the country's banking and shipping sectors, which is expected to deal further blows to Iran's already battered currency, the rial. The reaction in Tehran has been one of defiance as protesters took to the streets to denounce the US move. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani echoed that message.
We're in a situation of economic war, confronting a bullying power. During that time, it was Saddam. Today, it's Trump. There's no difference. We must resist and win.
And to discuss how this could play out and what's at stake for Turkey and the region, joining me in the studio, Farhad Rezaei, who is a political analyst and commentator, contributor with the Atlantic Council. And joining us from London, we have Mehrdad Khansari, who is a former Iranian diplomat. Gentlemen, thank you both very much for being here with Straight Talk. Farhad, I'm going to start with you. Turkey gets nearly half of its oil from Iran. This exception that they've been given will only last 6 months. If it's not renewed, how does Turkey make up this shortfall, and what impact does that have on the Turkey-Iranian relationship?
Well, first of all, I think Turkey will find itself at the middle of 2 choices. First of all, it needs to resolve its problems with the United States, and then that will cause him, convince him to comply with the sanctions. And then there is another dynamic at play. There is no way that Turkey and Iran can get around sanctions, because we have here that the Americans have full information about the previous round of sanctions, that they could screw sanctions. Apparently, Reza Zarrab and the head of the Halk Bank provided Americans with full information. So from that perspective, there is no way that Turkey and Iran can cooperate with each other.
So where does Turkey get its oil from then?
Oh yes, and then another. On the other hand, there is another dynamic at play, and that is Turkey gradually drifts away from the United States toward Russia and Iran. For Turkey, Iran and Russia seems to be a better fit than NATO. This is one factor. Another factor is that Turkey wants to have a stabilized Syria. This is also the goal of Iranians. So this dynamic might enable Turkey and Iran to cooperate with each other. That's why I'm saying that Turkey is at the middle of 2 choices. It's like a dilemma. So at the end of the day, it is Turkey's choice to choose which one should go for.
Mehrdad, let me bring you in here. We've seen Iran and Turkey cooperating quite effectively when it comes to Syria. They've held a lot of joint summits and talks together. If Turkey does reduce its oil reliance on Iran, what kind of impact is that going to have on their relationship and then on the situation in Syria in general?
Well, I think that's a very unlikely scenario, at the end of the day, because I think that there are too much stakes involved in Turkey's previous statements on the fact that it will not isolate Iran on this situation. I think has a great deal to do with it. But you have to bear in mind that on Syria, Turkey and Iran have not seen eye to eye on a consistent basis, although at this particular time, I think they are much closer to one another than they were, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago. I think that obviously, if there is tensions in terms of trade between Iran and Turkey Turkey abides by the provisions of the U.S. imposed sanctions in a way that's detrimental to Iran, obviously it will cause friction for Syria in the Syrian equation as well. Although, as I said, I don't believe that things are likely to escalate in a negative way between Iran and Turkey, given the level of dependence that they have on one another.
When we look at Iranian oil, China is one of the major importers of Iranian oil. They've come out to say that they don't have any intention of following Washington's orders and completely stopping their import to zero. The US wants the imports of Iranian oil to be zero. China says we're not going to do that. Does that undermine these sanctions altogether if their major importer is happy to keep doing business?
Well, for China, everything is political. I mean, when it comes to Iran, everything would be political between China and Iran. I mean, if China could get something from Washington in exchange, definitely Chinese will comply with the sanctions. But if China's compliance with sanctions would send a kind of weakness signal to Washington, definitely Chinese will not abide by sanctions.
Well, Mehrdad, let me ask you this then. If China and Washington do start playing ball and we do see China agree to reduce their Iranian imports to zero, what impact will these sanctions have on Iran? Are sanctions and economic strategies an effective way of getting Iran to change its behaviour?
Well, there's no question that the imposition of sanctions already, I mean, you don't have to bring Iran's oil export levels to zero in order to make an impact. The impact of the sanctions is already being felt. In fact, the impact of the upcoming sanctions were felt from the moment that President Trump announced that those sanctions were going to be reimposed, given the dive which the Iranian currency has taken in the last 4 or 5 months. But the question is that bringing Iranian exports to zero and cutting off Iran's income to zero, this is not a very likely prospect in the best of circumstances from the standpoint of the United States. And you have to bear in mind that over this particular issue, it's not just a question of bilateral relations between the US and China. It is a fact that the United States is isolated on the question of reimposition of sanctions against Iran, given the fact that the Russians, the Europeans, they are all not on board with the US policy and would try and assist Iran in ways that is possible in order for them to be able to manage. But the effects on the Iranian nation is significant. Economic growth forecasts have been severely reassessed. Iran will definitely have a negative growth rate in the coming year. The effects on inflation, employment, issues of this nature is going to hit Iran profoundly, and it will leave the Iranian government with the feeling that, you know, what is going to be at the end of the road? You know, that they may be able to survive, but can they provide long-term prosperity and economic growth and you know, things of that nature to their people for the future, unless they begin resolving these issues with the United States and some of its close collaborators over this issue?
Farhad, I'm going to ask you very briefly if you could just say whether you think these sanctions will be effective. Will it make Iran change its behaviour, do you think? Well,
this is actually questionable because Iran's security policies and Iran's foreign policy has no correlation with Iran's revenue. If you could look at the period of 2011 to 2015, which Iran was under the severe sanctions, Iran was more aggressive in Syria. Iran was more aggressive in the other countries, in Yemen. So actually, Iran's aggressive foreign policy is part of its forward defense. So it has nothing to do with its income. I mean, it's actually to offset Iran's weak conventional military. So I think this is not going to make any positive results for the Americans.
Farhad Rezaei and Mehrdad Khansari, thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.